Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by and welcome to As Turnover Grows, Will Flexibility Recruit and Retain webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, you may press the *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, July 11th, 2013. And I would now like to turn the conference over to Erin Jacobson. Please go ahead.
Hello, and thank you all for joining today's webinar, As Turnover Grows, Will Flexibility Recruit and Retain? As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and by the end of the day tomorrow, you will receive an email from us which will include today's webinar slides, recording, and information containing HRCI credits. This information will also be available at ere.net. Before we get to it, I would like to say a quick thank you to Jobvite for sponsoring today's webinar. I'd like to introduce Katie with Jobvite, who would like to take a few minutes of your time before we kick off the webinar.
Thanks, Erin. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Williams, the Marketing Programs Manager at Jobvite, and I just want to give you a little overview about what Jobvite does. We are a best-in-breed recruiting automation platform, which means we really only focus on recruiting and provide tools and solutions for social open web sourcing and search. We help you build and manage your talent pool while also making it easy for you to collaborate with teammates and coworkers. And we have incredible campaign management and job marketing functionality to offer, as well as full social referral tracking. And Jobvite also takes you all the way through the hiring process, from deep applicant tracking, workflow management, dynamic interview scheduling, and company branding with hosted career websites. So at Jobvite, we provide the tools to make every employee really part of the branding and the hiring process. Oops. And here are a few of our customers. We really have a lot of customers that are who's who in the corporate hiring and talent pool sourcing. We cater to pretty much all industries, from high tech to energy to healthcare. And as you can see, we also spend a lot of time with our customers like Twitter, Zappos, and LinkedIn, and many more to really drive products to be all that they are. So with that, thank you so much for letting us be part of the webinar, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. We are very lucky to have Paul Rupert speaking today. Paul is the president of Rupert & Company, a global leader in workplace flexibility consulting. Paul has consulted and trained in flexible schedules for the past 3 decades. Welcome, Paul. I'll turn this over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. Excuse me, Erin. Welcome to everyone, and good morning on the West Coast, and good afternoon in the rest of the country. I want to spend a little time today with you talking about this whole question of the sort of changing picture of the labor market and the potential, the value, and some of the issues around flexibility in the workplace. As Erin said, I've been involved in advocacy and consulting on this issue for a long time. A couple of friends who saw the title of this webinar said, "What, have you suddenly turned against flexibility? You don't think it can recruit and retain?" And my simple response was, no, of course I haven't turned against it, and I think it absolutely can. But we've had a long recession. We've had some substantial changes in what's happening with flexibility and what's happening in our labor markets. And there's a real need to look at some of the assumptions we make about what flexibility can and can't do. 5-year-old assumptions aren't necessarily going to solve the problems we face as labor markets tighten in the year ahead. So I'm going to walk you through some of that. I think you'll see in the first slide the excuse me, what we'll cover. And let me just say, there's a technical glitch here or there in this program, some incompatibility issues, so bear with us. But essentially, what we're going to cover today is this larger question of the falling unemployment rate and the growing turnover that goes along with that. Excuse me. Secondly is, there is a mantra out there which many of you have heard, maybe some of you have participated in saying, which is that flexibility absolutely can recruit and retain. And that's what we're going to look at, that mantra. And specifically the reality, and I think we're going to see some flex retains, some doesn't. The big surprise, I think, is that the mantra itself focuses on recruiting and retention. I think the recruiting power is very much overstated, and we're going to talk about that. And in that context, we're going to talk about the difference between regular flex and what I call sticky flex, and the question of, can flexibility have the recruiting power of the proverbial tractor beam of the Star Wars era? I think it can. Generally, in most cases, I don't think it does. I think that's where the opportunity really exists for changes in how we approach flexibility. If you bear with me on this chart, this is, I think, the most significant thing underlying the importance of this topic and the recruiting challenges that we're all facing. Nobody is happy with the pace of the recovery from the recession, the biggest and greatest, the longest recession in our lifetimes. But there has been recovery, and that continues to grow and to be steady. If you look at this chart, you'll see the dark blue line, which shows the gain in employment for the month of May is 175,000 new private sector jobs. If we added the June numbers, which just came out as 195, what you'll see looking at this over the year is, yes, more jobs have been added every month. At the beginning of this period, there's that little dip that was the period when we were all afraid there was going to be a double dip recession. So the amount of hiring every month was sort of limited. You get into the second half and you get into this month and you're getting much closer to an average of 200,000 jobs every month. Now you can say, well, there's still 7% unemployment, so really things aren't changing that much. It's not that much pressure. But it is important, and I won't spend time on this and bore you to death with it, but if you go inside those numbers, there are all kinds of unemployment. And if you're starting to look at the people who companies really want to hire, who they feel are job ready and have the necessary skills, we are at a level of unemployment much lower than this 7%. We're starting to get to the point where we were pre-recession when people were thinking that talent was scarce, hard to find, hard to keep, etc. So I think that's the backdrop. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is, so what does falling unemployment or increasing unemployment lead to? Well, for a long time, there's been this sense out there that there's going to be great turnover once we get closer to full employment, that dissatisfaction, fairly flat wages, etc., are going to bring people to the point of going for a new job as soon as conditions improve. Well, it's this falling unemployment that leads to that potentially greater turnover. That also means that you see a tightening of labor markets externally and internally. You see unfilled positions starting to occur more regularly, more systematically in companies, taking longer to hire, having positions that are open for a very long period of time. And therefore, you see, and many of you in the audience I know are in the recruitment business or some aspect of that, the talent business, you start to see the emphasis on recruitment and retention, which in turn leads people to say, well, flexibility is one of those things. Let's explore that a little bit more. Excuse me. The one thing, it'd be great. People should not be shy. If you have questions, do use the chat function and feel free to ask about whatever's on your mind, what you disagree with this or agree with. But you have to say, well, is this really happening? And you hear lots of conflicting stories about what's the state of the labor markets, blah, blah. I think there have been surveys for a long time saying people are going to job switch when things get better. Let's look at some of the data that suggests maybe some of these things are actually starting to happen. There's a recent survey, and quite an interesting survey in all of its detail, that was publicized in an article that John Holland wrote in Talent a while back. And the title of that was Half of Companies Report Higher Turnover Than Last Year. This was an OI Partners survey of about 153 companies, a pretty diverse group if you look at the detail of the survey. And they were trying to understand what are the dangers of and the experience of talent loss in an improving job market. Their core finding was that 51% of the companies surveyed report having higher employee turnover in 2013 compared to only 30% that had higher turnover in 2012. That's a significant difference. They found it compelling, and you'll see in a minute the detail that underlay those larger numbers. They talked about, in some of the tabs in the survey, where they were most concerned about the turnover happening. There's turnover, some would say there's turnover, and then there's turnover. There's desirable turnover, there's undesirable. This seemed to be a fair amount of concern about undesirable turnover. The respondents to these surveys said that 78% of them, of these organizations, were concerned about losing high potential workers. 63% are worried about middle managers departing. 51% about losing frontline workers, and 43% senior executives. Those are pretty substantial numbers. Now again, it's a survey, and we don't have enough hard data at this point. Your experience would be helpful in knowing whether that's what you're seeing. Is that just fear? Is that fear plus reality? Is it increasingly reality? But in any case, they have that problem. So what did these same folks who responded to the survey say about what they were going to do about this problem? In other words, is flexibility going to be helpful to them in retention and recruitment? Well, it's interesting, again, breaking them down by the same four categories of employee. They were asked to rank the retention methods that they were planning to use to address this issue. And if you look at the high potentials, which everybody in this survey, and generally people are very concerned about both recruiting and retaining, they were looking at one of the primary methods for achieving these goals with flex hours and schedules at 45%, and another 22%, they broke out telecommuting as a separate thing. But those forms of flexibility were the #1 method people were contemplating to address this anticipated and real loss. With managers, 49% were looking at flex hours and schedules. It was the #2 priority for retaining managers, which parenthetically I have to say is interesting in that a large number of major companies, including many of our clients, don't generally offer a significant number of these flexible options to managers. But that issue aside, nearly half of the folks were planning to use these tools. Frontline workers was a little less, at 49% combined, but it was #4. Interestingly, senior executives, they were not planning to use any flexibility whatsoever. And I don't know whether that means that senior executives already have all the flexibility they need, or that all of the methods which were suggested, and there were 5 of them, all related to monetary means of recruiting and retaining senior executives. So money, not time, was the draw. So I think what this conjures up in my mind, and it's captured in a slide, and you see for those of you who have invested lately or ever have seen on most prospectuses, the alert that past performance is not an indicator of future gain, benefit, etc. I think that's fundamentally the message of this presentation, that we can't assume that the things that have worked in the past are necessarily going to work as effectively in the future unless we make some changes. And let me let me just say before I go into this, someone asked in the chat the question of how many companies were surveyed. There were 153 companies surveyed in that data that I just went through, which is, given the nature of that survey, a reasonable sample size, I think. But again, surveys are surveys, and we'll see how that plays out. Okay, so on this question of the assumption of recruitment and retention, why is that? Why has that been an assumption? Why does that continue to be one? Well, there's certainly a very substantial body of data that says employees greatly value flexibility, control over where, when, and how they do their work. And I think it's important to just take a minute here and just say that the recession has been dramatic, and there have been ups and downs on all sorts of things, and we'll talk later about comp and benefits in the mix of recruiting. So there's been a lot of disappointing environment for a lot of folks. But if you look at surveys, and there are abundant surveys within companies, within engagement surveys, within national surveys, the desire to have more flexibility, to have greater control, whether that's part-time schedules or telecommuting or whatever it might be, has increased steadily year in and year out for the last decade. And it's continued unabated during the recession. It's not been the case that times are tough, money's tight, benefits are shaky, and so we're going to settle for less flexibility. The demand for flex seems to be on a continuing upward trend. So given that, what is it that companies are typically offering, or employers are typically offering? And the answer is they're pretty much offering the same things now that they were offering a number of years ago, with the exception of telecommuting, where you've had a lot of full-time home-based work connected to reducing office space use in a lot of major companies, and a general growth in telecommuting, which follows the technology to some extent. But generally, the offers around part-time or job sharing or compressed work weeks or phased retirement, any of those things have been pretty static during the last 5 years, during this recession. I don't think they've been reduced terribly, but they have not grown terribly. You will find in those companies that do have the various kinds of options that satisfaction and engagement scores seem to be higher for those people who use flexibility. I say seem to be because this varies by survey methodology and other stuff. But generally, there do seem to be significant reports that employees are more satisfied and that they're more engaged when they have these arrangements. But the critical question remains. Being satisfied is one thing. Does it mean you're going to stay with your current employer if you have these things? Does it mean it has the power to attract you to a given employer if you don't have these things? And I think that, again, that's really our focus. So if we flip to the next slide, you'll see that this wonderful Zen-like slide asks the simple question, is retention flexibility's sweet spot? And we ask that question because, and I think this is an important part of going back to the idea of the mantra, starting as early as the mid-1980s in the publication of the first seminal works on flexible work arrangements, the fundamental argument about the value of flexibility was that it helps you retain highly valued talent. That mantra, I read a piece yesterday that made the same assertion, and that's almost 30 years later. So it has been a consistent theme. It has literally been made thousands of times. It's in every set of guidelines we've ever written for any company we've ever worked with. It's been in the endless handbooks on flexibility produced by companies independently. It is an article of faith that you can rely on this to retain highly valued talent. Okay. That assertion, that belief, that assumption is really based on sort of two core assumptions. That is, one, that flex work meets the major personal and family needs of people, and because it meets those needs, people value it and want to stay where they have it. They want to be able to keep it and count on it as they organize their personal and family lives. The second is related to that, which is, well, once you are on a flexible schedule in a given company, you're going to stay there because if you leave, you lose it, and you're not going to be able to get it wherever you go. So it has what I call later a sticky quality to it. I think those things, by the way, are true, but like anything, it depends. And the title of this presentation was "It All Depends." Well, this is one of the places where it really depends. How well does the flexibility you have meet those other needs? How flexible is it? Or to sum it up, is the flexibility that's offered by most employers these days the flexibility that people need? And I think the simple answer is yes. Some flex is better than none, but some flex is often what's offered. What I mean by that is flexibility is to some degree in the eye of the beholder. You are grateful for being able to adjust your start and quit time by a half an hour or an hour on a daily basis, but if you have a 2.5-hour commute, that may not be that satisfying. It's great if you can telecommute and you have a terribly long commute, but if you can only do it a day a week, it's almost as frustrating as it is satisfying, according to comments we've heard many, many times in focus groups. In other words, if the access is random in general, and the nature of the options is somewhat random, so there are fewer options. You've got skeptical managers as a small or large percentage of your organization. You've got unnecessary controls on use. And I use the example I mentioned. I'd reiterate this. I certainly would not prescribe what's the perfect number of days a week to telecommute. What can any company send? It has to be decided, obviously, on a case-by-case basis. But there are many companies that do have a uniform decision that says, yes, you can telecommute, but only 1 day a week. Well, as I say, that's good to have, but is that fully satisfying of the need you have, whatever it may be that drives that desire to telecommute? Within the flexibility that occurs, there also tends to be a fair amount of rigidity. That is, you can think of flexibility as a program, as a static schedule change that is unchanging once you have it, or you can think about flexibility in its meaning of fluidity as something that's adjustable, that's changeable, that can modify with circumstance, that you can do. In one of our recent clients offered a set of these kinds of flexible options, and then they offered the option they called hybrid. And the hybrid had in it the ability to move from a compressed schedule to telecommuting to a flex time schedule, and to do that within the context of the work and the requirements. I would describe that as either collaborative scheduling or as fluid flexibility, but it is not a flexible program. That's a very rare kind of flexibility to find. So if you look at the options, if your options are limited telecommuting, no compressed work week, which, by the way, almost very, very few companies now offer compressed work weeks to their exempt level or managerial employees. It's a highly desired option on the part of most people, but as a matter of policy, it's typically not offered at all. So if you've got limited telecommuting, no compressed work week, part-time with a price, and there's been a virtual library that's come out of late of research on the negative effects on the careers of people who use part-time work in their ongoing schedules. If you look at all those kinds of limits on flexibility, then the question is the flexibility that is offered the flexibility that is wanted or needed? The answer is going to be, well, not so much. So if you flip, I think the simple summary on the next slide is it satisfying? Maybe. Is it retention? Maybe not. And this, I think, is where the rubber meets the road in terms of this question of assumption. If you assume that because some people have some flexibility, that therefore it is a retention tool, I think you're making a substantial leap, unless you have internal evidence to the contrary. And that evidence is typically some combination of serious survey or focus group or other work that says to you, yeah, this workforce does in fact choose not to go to employer Y instead of stay here because they have these kinds of arrangements. to head into the next turbulent period on the basis of the assumption that these tools are creating retention is, I think, a dangerous strategy. So that leads us then to the question, is the actual flex sticky or not? And I would say simply that flex can please, can satisfy, it can even engage. And I don't want to understate or underestimate the importance. When you are on an arrangement that you like, whether it's perfect or not, with your given employer, there is no question that there is a positive satisfaction effect and there can be a positive engagement effect, contingent on some other things. But basically, I think there's substantial work being done that demonstrates that, yes, you can achieve that engagement. But the question of whether or not these things are likely to retain is different. It really depends on if you have an arrangement that you deeply value and think you can keep. And I just mentioned a couple quick things there on the if you think you can keep. We've already talked about if it is the flexible arrangement you want, then it's some knowledge that somebody is not going to come in one day to the organization and announce, oh, we're abolishing telecommuting here. That could happen, I suppose. You don't have that concern, or one of the things that's true of most programmatic flexibility is it almost always has the caveat in it. You can have this kind of flexible schedule, but if you're transferred to another department, or often if you get a new manager, or if you get promoted, the assumption is that you will lose the flexible arrangement you have. And that's often a matter of policy. It's not a matter of individual decision. So knowing that you can keep the arrangement over time is a very important principle. The second is the stickiness and retaining you is a question of whether or not other employees don't offer similar options. I said a minute ago that part of the appeal of these things is, hey, I can get this here, I've got it, it's real, it works, and I really can't get it anywhere else. And I think that's again a changing assumption. As more and more companies do more kinds of flexibility, the more that claim I think is suspect. And then I say your option is rare enough. Like if your option is rare enough, like pensions of old, to be a golden handcuff or to prove truly sticky. I will say, as an example here, very few companies do phased retirement. But if you have valuable older workers and you want to do knowledge transfer and you want to keep them, and especially you don't want them to go somewhere else, phased retirement programs are so rare that it's a very sticky kind of glue for a program. Same thing is true of job sharing. If you have a good, strong job sharing arrangement in a company that allows job shares to promote as a team, very, very hard to go somewhere else and start as a job sharing pair, certainly in a middle level. And the same thing about professional part-time. If you have something like a 90% part-time schedule or 85%, whatever it might be, and you want to go somewhere else, very, very tough to come into an organization and get that kind of thing. We do offer the teardrop on the right, which is that I think one of the assumptions for many years was that telecommuting was a very sticky option, that it was not that common, not that popular, and people really loved it. And people do, by and large, by all kinds of measures, love telecommuting when they do it, whether it's full-time or a couple days a week or what have you. But the interesting thing about telecommuting is it's growing so rapidly and it's becoming so common that unlike almost every other flexible option, you have a much better chance of getting it anywhere you go than something like part-time. So its stickiness is beginning to fade. And I think in terms of the field and all the rest, I think that's a positive. But for an individual company thinking that because we do a lot of telecommuting, we're safe, I think that's dangerous. The other thing I would add here, just as an aside, I think was said in the beginning, I've been doing this for a long time. When I started consulting on flexibility in 1986, and the term flexible work arrangements was first introduced and was being used interchangeably with flexibility, when people said flexibility, what they really meant and often said was flex time. That is, flex time was simply adjusting your start and quit time on a regular basis. Most flexibility then was flex time, so that's what people thought flexibility was. In the interim, of course, it's become a variety of practices. What's happening now, interestingly enough, is that telecommuting is becoming the new flex time. That when people say flexibility in the ears of many, many listeners, what people hear when they hear flexibility is they hear telecommuting. That's neither good nor bad. It's just a fact that it's become ubiquitous enough. It's become the Kleenex of flexible work arrangements. Okay, so those are questions I think to look at around retention. Again, I believe flexibility still has retention power and can help prevent some amount of turnover. But I think one wants to take a real hard look at how one offers it and what one offers to make sure that occurs. So now I want to flip to the other piece of this mantra, which is, so what about recruitment? And again, the term retention and recruitment, they are not equal forces within the powers of flexibility. I think recruitment has always been an oversold and overstated function of flexibility. I think it does sometimes offer that, and we'll go through that in a little bit of detail. It becomes terribly important because, as we've described already in the unemployment, turnover, etc. process we're going through, one's looking for recruitment tools and something with recruiting power. And the assumption when all those folks that responded to that survey said, gee, we think X, Y, and Z will work with this group of people, they were hoping that those things would work for recruitment as well as retention. So what we see here is, excuse me, if you look at, there's a whole body of survey. IBM started this in 1986. They did their first company-wide survey in which they did an interesting thing. They looked at what they called family-friendly benefits, and they were interested in the recruiting and retention appeal of various kinds of HR offerings. So they looked at compensation, benefits, and flexibility. And the question they posed was, what is most important to you in considering whether to stay with IBM or accept an offer from a competitor? That was essentially the wording. And they did that as every 5-year survey starting in '86, and they're still doing it. And in the beginning, if you go back to the '86, comp was number 1, benefits are number 2, and flexibility was a distant third. By the survey in 2001, or no, it was '96 was the first one, and then again in 2001 was more decisive. Suddenly, the three things were bunched very strongly. Flexibility, comp, and benefits were equally important to retention and to being recruited into a new organization. If you look at, there have been national surveys for the last 10 years that have done the same sort of questions. A lot of companies have done this. And what they've concluded is that flexibility is a very powerful thing. I'll give you an example out of our own experience. We conducted last year a series of focus groups with 20 of focus groups from 11 of our client companies. And we were looking at the millennials and what did millennials value and what were their views on flexibility, et cetera. And it was fascinating with them. They were talking about flexibility in general more than specific arrangements. But when we asked them to rank comp, benefits, and flexibility, in the majority of the groups, flexibility was ranked above compensation. And in the rest, it was second to compensation. And in all of the cases, it trumped benefits as a factor in the decision to hire. These were many of our client companies. They were generally seen to be somewhat more flexible. And for many of these folks, that had been a major draw, and they're coming to these organizations. So I think the question here is, when you're putting together a package when, and more importantly, when an employee of a given company or someone looking for their first or new job is looking, what are they looking for? How are they assessing? How are they valuing these things? And this, I think, is where the real Achilles heel of flexibility comes in, and that's this. When you make the pitch around compensation for a position, it's pretty concrete. Salary, incentives, 401k match. There are a variety of financial offerings that are very clear, all of which start on day one. Or you start accumulating toward all of them on day one. You look at benefits, similar. It's health insurance, dental, vision, a range of benefits programs. They too all vest in the first day. They're concrete. They're easy to compare from company A to company B. Then you get to flexibility. And so if you think, okay, we think this is a major part of our profile, of our brand, of our value, and people should flock to us because we're so flexible. How do you prove that? How do they know that as potential customers, if you will, of your company, as new hires? And if we flip to the next survey, next slide, the answer is the flexibility offering tends to be very, very different. And it's something like this. Well, we have flexibility, but not as part of this offer we're going to make to you. Or you can have flexibility here, but you can't apply for it until after you've been here for 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. And there may be other, you have to have a certain job rating, you have to have, et cetera. Or, well, we have flexibility here. Your manager will offer options from our menu and then decide on your proposal. And there's certainly a good chance you'll be able to get it. And then, by the way, and I mentioned this issue earlier, any arrangement that you do get may be terminated if you are promoted or transferred or you get a new manager or whatever. But so you look at that, and I'm not being facetious in these comments. These are common comments or written to a significant degree, a little more formally, but written into policy in most organizations. So what you're really saying to somebody who's interested or to whom flex matters a great deal, well, we have a flexible climate. We have some people doing these things. We're open to these things, which is certainly better than not having those things, and is a good thing to have. But it's never and can't ever be as concrete and as substantial a conversation as you can have about comp and benefits. So I think if you look at that general proposition, it's not necessarily a compelling case. So I think in summarizing those things, basically, you're in a position that you can retain some people through flexibility, but you can recruit maybe not so much as the mythology would go. And again, that doesn't mean there's no climate matters. We know from all kinds of our company research and work and sort of people do care that they're going to a flexible climate. They're going to somewhere where they have a chance of doing these things. So I don't want to suggest that the environment doesn't matter at all, but it is important to not overstate or overestimate the power of what a vague offering can do. And again, I think on the call there are a number of people that have experience in the whole recruiting field and know that concrete offers are a good thing to do. So I think in short, I believe that the question of is turnover really going to increase dramatically, the labor market's going to tighten, et cetera, I think those are given. Those facts are given. I think that will be the case, and that you're not going to see the same potential in flex going forward as people have seen or thought they saw in the past. I do think that it is important because so many companies are seeing flexibility and telecommuting as the same thing, to be particularly aware of the fact that the general availability of that option has really changed the power of it. What it could bring you 5 years ago, it will not bring you today. More than anything else, it has had that sort of change. And then I think companies are going to have to come to terms with the fact that when people are asking for flexibility, going into a new hire situation, they're not asking for programs. Let me go back for just a minute. The reason we did the millennial research a couple years ago is we grew somewhat weary of reading all of the accounts of the strange millennial generation that didn't want this or wouldn't do that, or preferred to work from Starbucks, would never come into the office, and all sorts of stuff. So we said, well, let's actually talk to a couple hundred millennials in focus groups and understand what it is they want. I thought one of the most interesting, out of 220 people in hour-long groups, so 220 hours of conversation about flexibility, no one ever used the term telecommuting. They also never used the term Starbucks, but their notion of flexibility was not a programmatic notion. They weren't thinking in terms of we want part-time or we want this thing. They wanted to be well-managed, to be well-developed in their positions, to get good, solid performance management in their organizations, and then to be able to control their time as needed, both for personal and personal reasons within business constraints. It was really a desire for what I called earlier fluid flexibility. They had no programmatic desire. And I think that's a very significant thing for companies to appreciate, because when millennials and others come along and say we want more flexibility, they aren't saying we want more of what we had in 2005 or 2007. They're saying we want true flexibility, which is the ability to move things around as required by our lives and our work. So I don't know if there are any questions that anybody. Okay, I'm going to talk now for a few minutes about. Okay, so I painted a somewhat bleak picture, but what about the question of what do you do about this? Now, I know that there's a mix of folks in the audience. Some of you are in HR and companies. Some of you are managers of work groups, and some of you are recruiting. So you'll, I hope, come at this from your respective positions. I think that the key about flexibility today, and let me just say a quick thing about where we've been and I think where we're going in the next phase. You can look at what's happened in this whole issue of flexibility. I mentioned 1986 as kind of the publication of the seminal book in the field, which is called Creating a Flexible Work Arrangement by Barney Olmsted and Suzanne Smith. And they laid out a notion of the various kinds of flexibility you could do and how you could go about implementing them. That was almost 30 years ago. And in that 30 years, I think what we've seen is a dramatic and largely successful and often quite innovative approach to flexibility happening across the boards. If you think of it as a 30-year national pilot project, I think what we've demonstrated is that yes, you can work in a whole bunch of different ways, and people can add the same or greater value to organizations working in a host of different ways, whether it's phased retirement or job sharing or working from home a day or 5 days a week, compressed schedules, whatever it may be, that we've demonstrated without a doubt that you can do those things. What we haven't done, I think, what we haven't been able to really do is to successfully apply those lessons to the kind of broader flexibility that seems to me would accomplish the retention and recruitment goals that all of us have. So what are some of those lessons, and what does that suggest we should do? Let me start with this first one, which is most of the flexibility that exists in most places, we see it, not all, but most, has been driven as an HR program, and programmatic options have been offered, and they're among the options managers can choose to approve or not. The diffusion of those programs through organizations, and especially into the majority of the organization, which is often not exempt staff, maybe hourly staff and others, the frontline workers that those folks in the survey were worried about losing and recruiting. The flexibility doesn't get driven into the organization because the line is not driving it. And when I say the line, I mean there may be some CEO supportive statement or comment, but leadership is not taking this to be a serious issue, engaged in it, and recognizing that we're talking about some transformation in the way work is done, and that that change needs support and leadership and pressure. So that is not hard as HR might try to accomplish these programs. That change is not something that can be accomplished outside the line, especially if parts of the line are resistant to it. So there really needs to be a shifting of this item onto the larger company agenda and to be a higher priority on the agenda. The good news about the bad news I gave earlier, which is the tightening labor markets, et cetera, is it will tend to drive these issues to the attention of the leadership of the organization. And that's good. So that's first. The second is, and I think this is an important thing, over those 30 years, much of the flexibility that has occurred has been begrudging flexibility. Okay, we'll do this. Let's erect these various defenses around it. Let's minimize the eligibility. Let's do X, Y, and Z. It's been perceived to be potentially negative and therefore to be defended against. That makes sense in the first years of a pilot period when you're trying to find what the dangers are and isolate them and prevent against them. We're well past that point. And the transition, I think, for this to be shifted in a positive way for companies and for your work is companies have to put a stake in the ground and basically say, we not only tolerate, but we support, we endorse, and we are committed to trying to create the broadest possible, what we call collaborative scheduling, or the broadest possible flexibility throughout the organization. And that's a desirable goal for a bunch of reasons, and we're going to do that. That question of having principles and saying, we are a flexible employer, or we are committed to collaborative scheduling, or however you phrase it, a very clear, firm statement is part, and can be, and I think should be, part of the employment brand, of the employer brand of the company. We had an interesting conversation with the folks from Jobvite in the course of preparing this presentation, and we were talking about, well, how do the things they do intersect with what we're talking about here? And they were telling us that they have within their system an employee referral process, which basically tries to harness and utilize sort of the social media and get employee energy out there to help tap into new markets and attract new hires. And we were saying, well, it's interesting, when we go into a company to do our initial assessment work around flexibility, we talk to everybody. We talk to senior leaders, we talk to managers, employees, and HR. And everybody has an impression or an opinion about how flexible a company is. The opinions that we find most often correspond to what we later find in the organization are the opinions of employees who are the users or the customers of the flexibility offering. And they usually have a pretty good sense. And so they are, as I was saying to the Jobvite folks, they are really the ambassadors If you want an employer brand around flexibility, the people that are the best ambassadors of that brand for you are your employees through something like their referral process, where they're out talking to people who are trying to figure stuff out and are listening to these vague descriptions of flexibility, who really want to know what's true, what can I get, what typically happens with people, how does it work here, what's the consequence if I do these things. All of those sort of nitty-gritty questions you want to know before you change jobs or get a new position. So I think that whole question of taking a stance, making it part of your brand, and then promulgating that notion out to your labor markets is important. I think thirdly, I would say, again, this is an odd thing, but for 30 years we've gone into companies and we've talked about this stuff, and somebody, usually many people, HR and leaders, will say to us, well, this really is only going to work if our managers can do this, and our line managers really are pretty weak. They don't really have the skills to do this. And when I first heard that in 1987 was the first time somebody said that to me, I thought, well, I guess it'll just be a little while for the training to kick in and whatever. But it's a continuing theme, which is that you somehow have to be a better manager than anybody is to do this. A, I don't think that's true, but B, I do think there are skills that make this far easier to do. Basic communication and conflict resolution and other skills. And unless and until companies pick up that mantle, say, okay, we're going to train people to do this well, they either won't do it well or they won't want to do it because they won't want to do it badly. I think that's just a fact. And again, the pressures in this period may finally push companies in that direction, but it's an important direction. Finally, I'll just throw out, it's an interesting thing, and it's probably longer than we have time when we talk about it in the Q&A, but we do have clients who offer flexibility from the first day. It doesn't have to wait for 3 months or 6 months or a year for you to do an arrangement. There's more of that happening now in the area of telecommunications. There's a lot more happening with companies hiring remotes in other cities who clearly are going to have to work in their other city from day one if that's where they're going to stay. But this is an area that's beginning to break down, but is really an area that can be conquered because the simple matter is flexibility is simply another aspect of how you perform. And people don't have you wait to contribute until you're 6 months in so they can see you're capable of contributing. it's a, huh? So people in this setting can do these arrangements for a period of time, and those arrangements can be assessed along with the rest of their performance. And if they're not working, they can be stopped. But they aren't. Again, they've been around a long time, and they're not that magical. And finally, it really helps if, again, part of moving this out of a sort of benefits-like and only HR-supported effort, if you've got a stronger line focus, flexibility can deliver greater operational value. There can be significant gain on a day-to-day basis for a manager or work group in working this way. That should be done. That focus is what I think will help move stuff along. If we can jump to one more. Yes, thank you. And one more quick slide beyond that one. All right. Just at the back, there are some resource slides which you can look at when you get your copy tomorrow. It's just some follow-up information we gave you on flexibility that you can access through our systems, and also contact information if you want to discuss any of this further. I'm going to stop there. If there are any quick questions, we can do them. Are there? No questions. No questions. Okay. Nobody quarrels with any of the outrageous statements I made?
All right,
Okay.
then I guess we'll
Thank you
wrap
very
it up
much.
here. Thank you. Just a quick reminder that by the end of the day tomorrow, you will receive an email that will include today's webinar slides, recording, and information containing HRCI credits. This information will also be available at ere.net. Big thanks to Paul for sharing with our audience today, and another huge thank you to Jobvite for sponsoring today's webinar. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect. Have a great day.